Welcome to Moments with Marianne. This is your host, Marianne Pastana. And we're here today with special guest, Jessie Harrold, who's here to share with us her new book, Mothershift, Reclaiming Motherhood as a Rite of Passage. So what if we saw motherhood as an opportunity for a mother to access a deeper sense of her own power and authenticity? Well, today's guest is here to share just that. So Jessie Harrold is a coach and doula who has been supporting women through radical life transformations and other rites of passage for over 15 years. She works one-on-one with women and mothers, facilitates mentorship programs, women's circles and rituals, and hosts retreats and nature-based experiences. So welcome to the show, Jessie Harrold.
Thank you so much for having me, Marianne. It's wonderful to be here.
My goodness, what an honor it is to have you here and to talk about this book. So what inspired you to write this?
I have been a doula, so supporting birthing mothers for the last 17 years or so. And I became a doula before I became a mother myself. And so when it came time for me to have my own baby, I didn't have the same kinds of questions about birth that maybe most people do because I'd seen a lot of them before. And my questions were mostly about what is going to happen to me afterward. Like after that kind of fourth trimester, that time, that 3 months that we think of as being a time of really intense emotional and physical healing, what would happen to me as a person and the way I walk through the world. And I was lucky enough to meet the woman who had become my doula at a talk where she said that the transition to motherhood takes 2 to 3 years. And I had never heard anyone say that before. And, it could sound a little bit scary, but to me, it sounded like permission to get this all wrong, maybe even regret my choice to become a mother sometimes, to feel like I was failing and to be on a big learning curve for a really long time before I needed to come to this sense of feeling fully embodied in my motherhood. And so this really set me on the path towards discovering this phenomenon called matrescence. And it was a word we didn't have at that time when I was going through this journey. But matrescence refers to that sort of biological, sociological, psychological shift that mothers go through when they become mothers.
Well, that's so interesting. So when we talk about the 2 to 3 years before the transition to motherhood, we're actually talking, is it about our bodies, about how we relate to the world? What does that encompass?
Yeah, it's all encompassing. I describe it as really impacting the entire ecosystem of your life. So you can imagine that becoming a mother might change the way you feel about your intimate partnership if you have one, or your relationships with your friends and community. One that nobody seems to talk about is that it changes your relationship with your own mother. It changes your relationship with your body and how you feel about being in your body. It often shifts the way we feel about our work and how we make our living in the world. It shifts our values, our identity, literally everything. and and I think that we just haven't been talking about that part of it so much in our culture, although it has always happened, I think, to us. But I think it's time to kind of bring that out in the open and say that it's normal. Motherhood is supposed to change you. And I think, our culture, we have this kind of idea that you shouldn't change in motherhood, that you should bounce back to your pre-motherhood self. And so what I'm positing here is that you're not meant to. That motherhood is meant to fundamentally change who we are, and that's not a bad thing.
I like that. So as you start on this journey, I know that you are a researcher at heart. Were there certain questions that led you to start just unfolding all of this? Like, would motherhood change me?
Yeah, that was definitely one of the questions, um, particularly given the kind of culture that we're steeped in that says that motherhood shouldn't change you, So yeah, what will happen to me after I become a mother, the favorite question that I have for the mothers that I work with and all of the people that I work with is what I call the who am I now that question. And so it's kind of who am I now that dot, dot, dot. Who am I now that I'm a mother? You can apply this to different areas of your life too. Who am I now that I'm, in this new career? Who am I now that I am describing myself as a creative person? Who am I now that I'm a writer, perhaps? So there's a lot of different ways in which we can look at this transformation as being an identity shift. And the other question that I had was, we are now starting to understand that matrescence is a thing. Like we're gaining some awareness. It's in the zeitgeist for sure. Um, but what we don't know is how matrescence unfolds. And our research and understanding of this process hasn't gone there yet. And that's really the other question that I was trying to answer in my book, Mothershift, and in through the work that I do with mothers, because I think we need to know sort of the trail markers along the way of this path so that we can orient ourselves to those things and feel really well supported at every step along the way.
So, were there any specific challenges or key challenges you faced while you're transitioning into motherhood?
I think I could go granular. I could kind of pull back and say, I mean, the whole thing was challenging. And I think I was lucky in the sense that because I was being supported by this mentor, this doula, who um, really helped to normalize some of the things that I was feeling. I feel like my transition to motherhood maybe had a little bit more ease to it because I was able to have more compassion and gentleness for that process. I would say one of the hardest things about the transition generally for a lot of mothers is that there's this aspect of the transition to motherhood that we forget to talk about or that we don't have the skills to talk about in our culture, which is that um, every time you move into a new version of yourself, you're asked to let go of what is no longer and to let go of that previous version of yourself. And in Mothershift, I talk about really actually feeling the grief of that, and allowing yourself to feel the grief of that and having that be okay and normal. I mean, certainly we still need support through it, but that it's normal. Um, and so I think that's a real stumbling place for a lot of mothers, again, because, we think of motherhood, especially when it's, otherwise happy, healthy, and wanted. We think of it as just a joyous thing, just positive, And so the idea that even in that context, we could have complex feelings like grief and sadness, ambivalence. I think that's new for a lot of people, and it really challenges a lot of us.
I know you describe motherhood as a rite of passage. What does that mean to you?
hmm I describe a rite of passage as one of those changes that changes everything. So it's a deep shift. It's not just a behavioral change, like a change to the things you do or a change to the things you're thinking and feeling. So it's not just that you're learning how to change diapers and make really strong coffee when you become a mother. It's a change to who you are. And a rite of passage, or using a rite of passage lens to talk about the transition to motherhood, allows us some of these kind of aspects of the transition that are definitely present but not talked about, including grief and including a phase of liminality or being in between. So maybe having your baby, you're not a mother, but you don't feel fully embodied in that motherhood identity. And so you're in this in between phase. And it's another thing that's not particularly well recognized in our culture. And I think using this rites of passage lens allows us to widen the aperture on how we think of the transition to motherhood and the huge spectrum of emotions and experiences that entails.
I know that you share in your book the four-phase model for transitioning to motherhood. Can you briefly walk us through that and how you came to developing this?
Yeah, absolutely. Um, So the model is called the Four Elements Model of Radical Transformation. And the elements that I use to kind of guide us along the way, and this can be used not just for the transition to motherhood, but I also use it with all of the clients that I work with going through all kinds of life transitions. So feel free to extrapolate. It begins with earth, then moves into water, then air, and then fire. And so, just very briefly, earth is a time of orientation. So, when we're going through a radical transformation, a change to everything, the entire ecosystem of our lives, it can be really overwhelming. Your body is changing, your relationships are changing, your work is changing, your everything. And so Earth is a time of really naming the change, of naming what's true now, how things have changed, and just kind of presencing that, orienting. I like to think of it as, getting your feet in the earth of what's true for you now. We talk about when you're walking through the woods and you get lost, which is often how matrescence feels like being lost in the woods. They don't say crash around looking for the trail. They say you need to sit down and look around and take stock of your surroundings. So that's what earth is all about. Then we move into water. That is the phase of grief, release, and loss that I spoke about earlier. They're very watery emotions, often with tears and the washing away of things that are no longer true for you. And so that's that next phase that we really have to go through. It's not fun, and it's not always well supported in our culture. But I think, I always say you can't do the growth without the grief. Like, we can't necessarily have all of this tremendous power and potential that's accessible to us in the process of matrescence unless we go through this grieving process and let go of what is no longer. And then we move into air, which is that liminal space that I talked about. It's called air because usually people in this phase, they throw up their hands and they say, everything is up in the air. I don't know who I am anymore. I don't know where I'm going. And again, very normal, but also not well kind of recognized or applauded in our culture. We like to have goals and know who we are and where we're going and be very confident. Um, and this is also a really necessary phase of the process, though we like to bypass it, I think. There's tremendous potential in holding in the liminal space and really beginning to hear who you're becoming. It's a place where we get in touch with our authenticity and our creativity and our intuition. So the next phase and the final phase of the four elements of radical transformation is fire. And fire, as you can imagine, is where we kind of begin to kindle those embers of who you're becoming. We start to explore what's true for you now, what you believe in, where you might, desire your life to go. It's a time when I advocate for mothers to experiment and to get playful and curious with, how they might become more of themselves in this transition, more authentic.
Thank you for taking the time to run through those. You go so much great detail in your book in regards to that, and I felt that they were so powerful. One of the things you mentioned earlier that I'd like to touch on, you talk about grief and loss.
Mm.
So when we talk about someone that is a new mother, why do you think these emotions get overlooked, and how can mothers process them in a healthy way?
Yeah, great question. I think we generally have not so many skills with, working with feelings of grief in our culture. Generally, we tend to ask, "Are you done crying yet?" instead of "Have you cried enough yet?" We really emphasize moving on and moving upward, right? So I think that that's certainly part of it. And I think we have even fewer skills to talk about what we might call disenfranchised grief. So the kind of grief that, our culture doesn't give us permission to feel. We sort of allocate the feeling of grief for bereavement, for death. And it's okay to grieve something or someone who has died, but not necessarily, it's not necessarily okay or sort of sanctioned in our culture to grieve other things, to grieve other aspects of our lives. When you really think about it, perhaps someone has died, your former self has died in a lot of ways. And there may be aspects of your life that return to you at some point. But as I like to say, it's never on your timeline, rarely. Um, and so, yeah, we lack the recognition. We also lack the skills. And so I advocate for mothers. I say that grief wants to be felt. It wants to be honored. It wants to be metabolized, and it sometimes wants to be released. So to feel your grief, it's really just to acknowledge, hey, this is a sadness that I'm feeling right now, and to allow yourself to do that. Let yourself cry. Um, Let yourself process that in whatever way comes up. Um, then honoring that and sort of saying to yourself, it's okay to feel sad about this. And I think that's a big step again in a culture that doesn't recognize um, grief in its sort of more nuanced presentation as it might be in matrescence. Then to metabolize your grief is to move it through. Um, one of my teachers says that grief ultimately, it may not go away necessarily. Like you may still miss your pre-motherhood self, um, but it becomes right-sized over time. And I think that, metabolizing can be things like maybe moving your body, dancing it through, using creative practice, talking about it, in one way or another, making meaning of it. In metabolism, we draw the nourishment and keep the nourishment, and we let go of what's not serving us. And so that's kind of this process of working with our grief. And then, yeah, sometimes grief wants to be released. Sometimes it wants to be, sometimes it runs its course, and it feels important to say, I'm complete with that now. And not always. And so that sort of fourth step is a suggestion that, it might be something to intentionally think about. And sometimes, again, our grief becomes right-sized over time and we live with it. All of this takes time. And I think that's the beauty of saying that the transition to motherhood takes 2 to 3 years is that it gives us lots of time to really move through all of these emotions that come with it, and not bypass any of them.
Well, and it has me thinking for those moms that feel really disconnected from who they were before they, started the journey of motherhood. I mean, what advice do you have for them?
Yeah. We say that the worst thing that can possibly happen when you become a mother is that you might lose yourself in motherhood. And, there is nuance to this because it's hard to become and be a mother in our culture today. And there are aspects of our culture that create circumstances under which many mothers feel lost to themselves, when we have to return to work right after our babies are born, or when we're, you know, subject to unaffordable childcare and, the stressors that of raising a baby without a village, all of these things can certainly cause us to feel lost to ourselves. And these are things we should certainly work towards changing. And there is a certain extent to which the transition to motherhood has always required us to kind of separate from that who we once knew ourselves to be. And so my advice is not to kind of fight it. I think I see a lot of mothers who are trying to kind of scramble back to the way things were, like grasp at the way things used to be. And I see that causing a lot of suffering. And I also see mothers suffering as they try to kind of push forward into this new normal, um, without allowing themselves to kind of go through this process of grief and liminality and exploration of who they're becoming. And so my advice is to have patience, is to normalize the idea of feeling lost in motherhood, that you've lost yourself, and to remind us all that when we're well supported through this process, we find someone new on the other side.
Well, on that note, we're going to pause here for a quick break. We've been speaking with Jessie Harrold in regards to her new book, Mothershift, Reclaiming Motherhood as a Rite of Passage. You've been listening to Moments with Mary Ann. We'll be right back after these messages from our sponsors.
Are you an author, speaker, or expert who is looking for more publicity? Visit radioguestlist.com and sign up for free interview requests from shows looking for guests. Radio Guest List is the #1 free booking resource for radio, podcasts, and TV talk shows who are looking for experts like you right now. Visit radioguestlist.com and sign up today to get the visibility you deserve.
There comes a moment when you realize you're somewhere special. When you discover that each beautiful creature that you see has been rescued from a life of absolute horror and brought to this incredibly free place. Here's where their lives were forever changed and where yours will as well. Discover over 500 tigers, bears, and lions at the brand new visitor center at the Wild Animal Sanctuary just outside Denver. For more information, visit wildanimalsanctuary.org. Discover true freedom at the Wild Animal Sanctuary.
It's one thing to become attached to your perfect home, but what do you do when that home becomes attached to you? A family in dire need of a fresh start, a mysterious house tied to the past. Buried deep within the foundation of the old Far Hill Manor lies a centuries-old secret. Dark forces or something stronger just waiting to be discovered. Caretaker, a supernatural thriller by breakout authors R.J. Halpert.
Internationally recognized and award-winning author Judy Goodman works and teaches outside the box of limited thinking. Working with people from every walk of life, her goal is to empower you to be the best you can be, no matter what the challenge is. Born with the gift of seeing beyond our normal vision, she has an extraordinary gift of working with every challenge. Teaching beyond conventional wisdom, her work is described as life-changing. Visit judygoodman.com. That's judygoodman.com.
I'd like to thank Jason Eastwood at Guitarfulness for sharing his inspiring music and talent with us. His music is known worldwide for cultivating atmospheres of harmony, inner peace, and clarity. Visit Jason's website at guitarfulness.com. Join his newsletter, be part of his community, and download his music. Welcome back to Moments with Mary Ann. We're here today with special guest, Jessie Harrold, who's here sharing with us her new book, Mothershift, Reclaiming Motherhood as a Rite of Passage. Well, and it has me thinking for those moms that feel really disconnected from who they were before they, started the journey of motherhood. I mean, what advice do you have for them?
Yeah. We say that the worst thing that can possibly happen when you become a mother is that you might lose yourself in motherhood. And, there is nuance to this because it's hard to become and be a mother in our culture today. And there are aspects of our culture that create circumstances under which many mothers feel lost to themselves, when we have to return to work right after our babies are born, or when we're, subject to unaffordable childcare and, the stressors that of raising a baby without a village, all of these things can certainly cause us to feel lost to ourselves. And these are things we should certainly work towards changing. And there is a certain extent to which the transition to motherhood has always required us to kind of separate from that who we once knew ourselves to be. And so my advice is not to kind of fight it. I think I see a lot of mothers who are trying to kind of scramble back to the way things were, like grasp at the way things used to be. And I see that causing a lot of suffering. And I also see mothers suffering as they try to kind of push forward into this new normal, without allowing themselves to kind of go through this process of grief and liminality and exploration of who they're becoming. And so my advice is to have patience, is to normalize the idea of feeling lost in motherhood, that you've lost yourself, and to remind us all that when we're well supported through this process, we find someone new on the other side. And that person often has, deeper empathy, is better able to hold paradox and complexity, has, an awareness and acknowledgement of the interdependence of our human species. There's so many, they're often creative and intuitive, and there are so many gifts that matrescence has to offer. But in many ways, we actually have to lose ourselves in the process before we can fully step into those. And so I always want to remind mothers of the possibility and the potential and the power that also exists here.
So I know in your book you talk about motherhood that has superpowers, and I'd love for you to expand on that for our listeners.
Yeah, absolutely. So the second half of the book I devote to what I call the mother powers. And yes, that's a great segue, because that's exactly what I'm talking about. These skills and capacities that we have the potential to develop um, during our matrescence time. And so they are things like self-tending, which is a little different than self-care, I talk about in the book, creativity, community, inner knowing, embodiment, earth connection, and ritual. And so all of these things some of them are things that are sort of handed to us on a silver platter in a way through the process of matrescence. For example, embodiment is one of them. Whether or not you've birthed the baby you're caring for, um, motherhood is pretty viscerally embodied, and it's kind of forces us to um, explore our relationship with our own bodies. So that mother power of embodiment is sort of handed to us, like, here, you have an exquisite opportunity to explore this right now. Others are maybe less obvious, things like earth connection. A lot of mothers actually feel more deeply connected to the ecosystem around them as a result of their transition to motherhood. And there's been some scientific research around this, which is really fascinating. And so, with earth connection, we can kind of intentionally explore that as a mother power. Like, what would it mean to use this opportunity to connect more deeply with the earth? And the whole point of the mother powers is, they're skills and capacities that can support us through this transition. Yes. And they're skills and capacities that can kind of help us in our motherhood generally. Yes. And they're also incredibly counterculture. If you think about those 7 skills and capacities, they're things our culture doesn't do so well right now, and maybe doesn't value as much right now. And so they're also the skills and capacities that our world really needs. We need people who are more creative, who are embodied, who know how to care for themselves well, who know how to tend to community, who are reverent of the earth and our connection to it. And so I also see the mother power as being this way in which mothers can offer up a tremendous amount of potential to the world we're living in, and make it a better place to be.
I know this book includes a lot of areas where we can do self reflection and self inquiry and as journal prompts. Why do you think it was so important to include these in this book?
Well, I think that it's a very practical book. I'm a very practical person, and I guess if anything, Mothershift is based on a program that I've been guiding mothers through for almost a decade, and so these journal prompts were ways of making that work a little bit more accessible to people. But I think I think it's important to reflect on our own process, and to, I do think of it, of like the 4 elements model as like a little bit of a map, and there's trail markers along the way. And I think you get to pause and reflect on where you are now and how you're experiencing this particular aspect of matrescence, because everyone's experience is different. And I think it helps us to kind of move through and feel oriented in this experience that has previously not been well articulated or mapped out.
I think that's so important to have a roadmap to kind of get us through this period of time because do you find it's different for everybody or there's some kind of road marks that every woman meets as they're going through this process?
Yeah, definitely both. I'm always really fascinated by the similarities, and I think that might have been the thing that sort of ultimately compelled me to write this book. Is just the things that, I'll never forget. I was teaching an infant massage class. It was probably more than a decade ago, I'm sure. And, we were supposed to talk about things during infant massage class, like, diapers and breastfeeding and whatever else. And it wasn't until afterwards that we started talking about the things that nobody ever told you were a thing. And I remember this one day we started talking about our relationships with our mothers. And yeah, and everyone was having this experience of this radical shift, sometimes positive, sometimes not positive, in their relationships with their own mothers. And everyone just said, no one ever told me this. I describe it in the book as the anthem of modern motherhood. No one ever told me. No one ever told me. And so my hope with this book is that it's a place where some of those common experiences can be named. So at least we can find ourselves and feel a little bit more normal, because so many people are having those experiences and we're just not talking about them.
That could be a really huge one if you think about it. I wouldn't even think about something, but the relationship we have with our mothers, I mean, that has to hugely impact the relationship we have with our children.
Absolutely. Yeah. And the way we think of ourselves as mothers, our generation of mothers has different access to information. We have different evidence around parenting. And we're often choosing to do things really differently than our mothers did. But we're also subject to, I would argue, social norms around mothering that are even more restrictive and difficult to uphold, I think, in many ways than our mothers experience. So we have this kind of experience where, like, yes, there's new information, and also um, there's a lot we can learn from our foremothers. And so it's grappling with that, right? And thinking about the way you were mothered and how you want to do this differently. And then your own mother becoming a grandmother, perhaps for the first time, and contemplating how that role plays out. It's very complex.
I can see where it would be for sure. And it has me thinking, so what role does community play in our transition to motherhood? And how can mothers cultivate more supportive networks?
Yeah, it's a great question, and I'm still asking it. I'm still asking it in my own life. We were actually, and I talk about it in the book, we evolved to raise our children in community. We have these, we are what's called reproductively hyperburdened. We have the ability to have children in, very short time spans, subsequent children in very short time spans, and not a lot of ability to care for that many children and for the demands of the children we do have. Just evolutionarily, we evolved to require a village to care for our children. And now a lot of us are living in very kind of hyper individualistic nuclear family configurations that mean we don't have a village. There is one, maybe two parents responsible for all of this work that was meant to be done by many, many, many people. And so it's created a real challenge. I think I would say that most mothers that I speak to, this is a huge concern for them and a huge challenge for them. And, I think there's things we can do to create and build community. There are things that already exist, like mom and baby groups and, opportunities like that. There are things that we can do, like offering our own support to the people around us to the extent that we can. And asking for support is actually a beautiful way to grow community. But I also think there's a wider kind of collective ethos around community that can make it challenging for those individual actions to have an impact. And so I just want to like acknowledge that, I guess, that we have kind of a broader collective culture of hyper individualism. And so, I'll give a little example of that. Love to drop off homemade granola to neighbors or friends that I feel like could use a batch. And I remember bringing a batch of my homemade granola to a friend, and she just kind of looked at me with a puzzled look on her face and said, "How much do I owe you?" And, you know, there's a perfect example of sort of, this action that I did, but this overarching culture of transactional support and capitalism. We can pull that kind of awareness in there, and hyper individualism that makes community challenging. So I think we've really got an opportunity here to redefine how we raise our children and what community looks like in this kind of post-village world.
Oh my gosh, that makes me want to cry just hearing that. She must have been so exhausted that that's the only thing that she can think of, How much do I owe you? My goodness.
Mm.
What do you think are some of the places where you see like women really get stuck as they're trying to go through this process?
I think it goes back to those two elements of radical transformation that are kind of sandwiched between the fun ones, which are water and air, right? This grieving, this sort of contending with having lost yourself, and then spending some time just not knowing who you are before that becomes more clear. And I think the biggest challenge is not necessarily, simply that that's not easy to do, but that we have these demands from our culture to kind of get back to the way you were, get back to normal. And I also want to name the challenge that kind of exists in the culture around us. And so we've got social policy that is not supportive of mothers in so many ways. We've got the loss of the community around us. We've got a maternity care system where we're seeing rates of maternal mortality that are unacceptable. So there's also, it's not just mother's individual experience and what they are or are not doing or are not exposed to or supported with. It's also the wider system that we're becoming mothers in. And so I want to acknowledge that, because it's not just you, it's not, you that needs to necessarily change what you're doing or do things differently. It's very much that our culture makes it's hard to become a mother in our culture these days.
Do you feel that, having gone through motherhood is something that other mothers should share their wisdom and gifts and talents with for new expecting mothers?
I do. Absolutely. Absolutely. I think they're, like I said, those things that we don't talk about, I think are really important to talk about. And offers this real sense of normalcy, I think, when we share what mothering is really about and it's really like, both the highs and the lows, right? Because I think we often hear one story or the other. We have this kind of narrative of motherhood being so beautiful and wonderful and sacred. And then we have this other narrative of motherhood being the worst job on earth, right? And both are true. Anyone who has become a mother knows that actually both things are true, sometimes all in the same minute. And so I think we need to really keep that in mind as we're sharing our own motherhood stories, and particularly on social media. There's a place where there's not always a lot of nuance in those shares, and remembering that it's complex and it's the most both and experience possibly you'll ever have. And so I think let's remember that as we're sharing our experiences with other mothers.
What would you like mothers and our readers and listeners to take away from Mothershift?
I think that the big thing is that transition to motherhood takes 2 to 3 years. Give yourself permission and time. And if it's not you that's become a mother, then offer that to the mothers around you, permission and time and compassion for this to be a longer process than you expected, perhaps, and to kind of feel that full range of emotions, I think is so important. And I think, while acknowledging the challenges that motherhood presents, absolutely, to also remember that it's okay to lose yourself in motherhood because you are becoming someone new. And there is tremendous power and potential in that. And I think that that's a really important message that we sometimes miss.
Well, Jessie, where can our listeners and readers connect with you and be part of your community?
Yeah, so I have a website, jessieharrold.com, and I send out what actually happens to be a very popular newsletter once a month called Imaginalia, and it's for people who are going through times of radical transformation, both matrescence and beyond. And then I'm on Instagram at jessie.es.harrold, so that's kind of the main social media place I hang out.
Well, Jessie, thank you so much for taking the time to be on the show with us here today.
Thank you so much for having me. Your questions are wonderful. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Jessie. It's been such an honor to spend this time with you and to talk about your new book, Mothershift, Reclaiming Motherhood as a Rite of Passage. Make sure to visit Jessie's website at jessieharrold.com. There you can be part of her community, learn more about her podcast, The Becoming Podcast, and about her book, Mothershift. Well, we're at the end of our time today. I'd like to thank everyone for tuning in. You've been listening to Moments with Mary Ann, where we make every moment count.
In a single moment, your life can change. Moments with Mary Ann is a transformative hour that covers an endless array of topics with the best of the best. Her guests are leaders in their fields, ranging from inspirational authors, top industry leaders, and business and spiritual entrepreneurs. Each guest is gifted and a true visionary, a recognized leader in her own work, and while teaching others to develop, refocus, and grow, Mary Ann will bring the best guest and sometimes a special surprise. Don't miss this. You never know just which moment will change your life forever. Make sure to tune in and visit momentswithmaryann.com for more information.